College football nerds, we are back. We took another little break because we weren't sure if we are going to have a season or not, y'all, with all the cancellations back in early summer and then on August 11th when the Big Ten decided to at least put things on hold. But it's Sunday night, and there is discussion that they are going to make an announcement tomorrow that they are going to open the season back up for Big Ten football, possibly starting October 17th. So I got Josh with me. We're going to talk about how teams, not just the Big Ten, but the rest of the teams that are playing this fall are going to have to navigate the COVID world that we live in and get through to the finish line and actually have a season and what that's going to take. And we're going to maybe put it in a little bit of a Big Ten spin or angle because it's important to discuss that. We're hoping beyond hope that they make it back this year. You Big Ten fans absolutely deserve a season as much as those in the SEC, ACC, and maybe the Big 12 fans want to just put a reset on this season after this weekend. Josh, that's a good segue into what we saw this weekend, and it was a lot of rust. And I think some of that is rust and some of that is teams just aren't as good as we thought they might be. But it was clear, at least early on, that teams were sort of running through quicksand and had heavy legs or just weren't all there. Miami got to a slow start, Notre Dame with Duke, and we saw all the upsets. And I want you to talk about how there's probably a good explanation for the rust, the obvious one being COVID, but talk about that in relation to how the Big Ten might navigate this or the hurdles that they might have that are unique to them, given that they might start, let's go with October 17th, they might start on the 17th versus the teams that may have been playing for a month or so leading up to that.
I think we saw a lot of stuff in the opening weekend that indicates what is and is not a problem for different teams. The first one is there's a disadvantage to limited practice time. Everybody missed spring practice, and you got a little longer time in fall, or you will have a longer time in fall. I'll let you comment on that a little bit, but I think the first thing you have to note is it's pretty clear that not having spring practice is not a good thing. And when you watch like FSU in their opener, they lose to Georgia Tech. They were heavily favored in that game. I don't know if Blackman's the starting quarterback, or at least that they're going to have the same offense if they knew what they were going to get. And you can only learn so much in controlled fall camp scrimmages. I mean, ideally, you have a big, spring practice. You have a big, real lifelike game situation. You see your quarterback in action. You have all spring and then summer to make a decision on the sort of direction you want to go offensively. And in the fall, you're just installing it. And they're making all those decisions on the fly. So there's a lot of stuff this year early on, especially where not only is it that they're rusty, but I think also you have teams that maybe they've got a player starting in certain spots that they're not going to go with. And I think you're going to see a lot of teams really change up personnel and scheme in the first few weeks of the season, way more than normal, especially personnel decisions. And then there's other considerations, right? Like, Navy comes out and they haven't been able to do, really tackle, or they hadn't been doing tackle football, even though they have been practicing. Because they were concerned about COVID issues. So even when you do have practice, it's limited. Big Ten has a lot longer to practice. Maybe they're able to settle some of those issues, and maybe they're able to not come out like Florida State and look just completely unprepared, or not come out like Navy and look unprepared. And they're going to learn some lessons from how those teams maybe conducted themselves. And I think, they, to a certain degree, if you're like Ohio State, you generally want to avoid a loss or two. And I think some good teams have lost games. Like, I don't know how Iowa State's going to finish, but I'd be a little slow on jumping on the bandwagon if Iowa State sucks, because those teams may have been impacted by the limited practice time. I think some of the Big Ten teams may be a little more stable, let's put it that way, by the time they actually get around to play.
And to me, I think there's some benefits here. You mentioned more practice time without having a spring practice. I think SEC teams actually benefiting a little bit because they're starting September 26th. And we had ACC starting this weekend, Big 12 starting this weekend. So there's some benefit there only because the conferences are playing really one another now. Not playing one another. They're playing within their own conference. So really everybody's on the same page, the same starting point. But if that same starting point is one of high variability because you haven't had a lot of practice and chance to install things, you might have a loss as a Clemson early on or as a Florida State early on that you wouldn't have had in week 7 because those things will finally get up to speed. Whereas the SEC starting September 26th has a couple of more weeks to really get acclimated and figure out some of those personnel issues that you talked about. Is it possibly a positive? So there's a negative, as you mentioned earlier, of not having played a game, and there's a rust when you're starting fresh. But is there some positive for the Big Ten in terms of optics and looking like they're playing good football if they have been practicing this whole time, and now they're going to get practice all the way up to October 17th?
I definitely think there's a lot of advantages to it. I mean, what we saw out of the Big 12, and we like sketch out an outline, and I'm jumping way ahead on Daniel here. But what we saw out of the Big 12 was kind of a disaster of an opening week with a lot of teams. And it's like I mentioned with Iowa State. How much of it are they just kind of dodging a bullet by not playing those games right now? I mean, if you're not playing a non-conference game, does that just keep you from losing a stupid game you shouldn't lose to an outside conference? Not necessarily because you're a bad team, but just because you're not ready. And there's some issue on your squad that you're not prepared for. How much are your good teams not losing to randomly to worse teams? I don't buy that Georgia Tech's going to be very good this year. And I felt like, we had a whole preview where we were kind of bullish on Florida State. I'm still not sure that we were necessarily wrong on what they're going to be at the end of the year, but we were wrong in week 1. And I think there's an advantage to not playing right now. One, to not expose yourself if you're not playing non-conference games early. The ACC is going to be better off because they got a couple weeks under their belt. And I think, again, it's about more like stabilizing your performance more than it is increasing quality. We talk a lot about football as a variable sport with high variability. And if you want to win a championship or be a top tier program, you do everything in your power to avoid variability because you don't want to lose very many games at all. And if you're highly variable and they're highly variable, a good team that has a lot of variability is going to drop 2 or 3 games where they have a bad day at the wrong time. That's what we talked about a lot, like Urban Meyer versus Ryan Day. We were really high on Ryan Day because we felt like Ryan Day was a lot more stable in his outcome than we had been very disappointed with Urban Meyer because his team could be really, really up, but they could also be really, really down. And it's hard to win a championship like that. So I think there's a lot of advantages to playing later. It's a lot of advantages to having your record really reflect performance. But I think that's especially true because, we talk about it a lot, right? That people look too much at win-loss records, and people are going to expect for you to be a playoff team, you're going to have a great win-loss record, and they're going to probably read way too much comparing conference versus conference than they actually should in that regard.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that a little bit because we catch a lot of flack sometimes, especially from Big Ten fans, because we talk about how, the Big Ten adds that 9th conference game and they assume automatically that their schedule is harder. It may be, it may not be. A lot of it depends on conference strength. And if you don't have those external data points where you might have a Michigan, Ohio State that do a really good job of getting those Power 5 out of conference big time games to get that comparative data point, there's a lot of other teams that don't. So if you beat a team with a clean record in conference or a P5 team that's a Rutgers or somebody else, I know Vanderbilt, Arkansas, I know. We don't necessarily know how good you are. And it's even worse in conferences like the Pac-12 or last year with Baylor. So this year, is it just absolutely amplified in that we're not going to know anything because we're expecting to know conference strength, but this year it's just everybody's circle the wagon. So is there some concern about not knowing if teams are good or not?
There has to be. And we talked about going into bowl season last year, and we took some flack from Big 12 fans that the Big 12 had played no meaningful out-of-conference games. And their record in the out-of-conference games they did play was actually really poor, but they played so few of them that I don't think people noticed what their win percentage was and how many games they were losing to teams that were worth a flip. And that showed up. I mean, the Big 12 had a really, really rough bowl slate, and I think that was reflective of the fact that the Big 12 records really didn't mean anything. I mean, if you take the ACC, for example, there's 15 teams, they're going to play 10 games each. You're going to go 75 and 75. It doesn't matter how good you are or how bad you are. Your conference as a whole is going to go 75 and 75 against itself. You have to. So normally there are enough non-conference games floated in there that your win-loss records are a little bit more inflated. You talk about like, well, you beat you beat a team like Mississippi State. Well, at least Mississippi State went out and beat somebody else of note, right? Um, at least Kentucky went out and beat Louisville, and so you get an extra win or two in there. That we don't even have that this year. I mean, there's nothing. So if everybody in a conference goes 5-5, it doesn't mean the conference is bad. It could be an awesome conference, and it's just extremely difficult. Your win loss records are just going to be reflective of what the balance is within the conference, right? I mean, if you've got haves and have nots, you're going to have some really high win loss totals and some low ones. If you've got a lot of really good teams, you're probably not going to have that many teams or anyone doing better than like 8-2. Because you're going to drop a couple games because it's a hard slate and it's hard to have performance that high. So win loss records this year, it relative to your own conference, are they going to tell you something? Sure. If you're in a 15-team conference like the ACC, even that's a little dicey because you didn't play everybody in your conference, so you're going to look at conference schedule, but only really relative to yourselves within your own conference. But comparing conference to conference, I don't think you can compare win-loss records at all. I think it's totally meaningless this year. You're going to have to rely on the eye test for 90% of it and just say, am I watching good football or am I not? And you may know if a team's a good team in one conference, but you will have no idea how good they are in another.
And this makes me so happy because a big part of how we do our rankings and the teams that we've supported over the years, especially when we're talking about elite teams that are playoff worthy, has been the dreaded eye test. And I'm telling y'all, it's fair. The eye test is absolutely fair because the main component for us of the eye test is, do you beat the teams you're supposed to beat? Do you struggle against teams that you're not supposed to struggle against? And I think where it's really hard, Josh, I think the real challenge comes bowl season. Nobody knows what that's going to look like, but come bowl season, what do you do with a 7-5 ACC team versus a 7-5 Big 12 team? Like, how do you slot those teams? I mean, you just don't know. But one thing we do know is, and I hate when people do this. This really frustrates me when people are like, preseason polls suck. And it's a whole new year. Last year doesn't matter. Last year matters until about 4 or 5 weeks into the season. There's a reason why, S&P Plus considers the last year. It's not gospel, but look, we don't completely start over every single year. We don't reset the rosters every single year. Take Ohio State, for example. We know they've got some dudes on that team. We know that they've got a lot of talent coming over. We know they're well coached. That's a huge component of it that carries over year to year. We know they were beating people's brains in last year. They're going to do it again. That's why Alabama doesn't start out the next season ranked number 50 one year, ranked number 30 the next, because everybody knows they're going to be good. Everybody knows that Ohio State this year is going to be good. Michigan's probably going to be pretty good. Penn State's going to be pretty good. And then all we do is make sure that our expectations when they start playing are met throughout the season, or do they end up struggling with teams that other teams in the conference are murdering? And I think there is something there. It's not perfect. Nothing's going to be perfect this year, but I think, and you can expound on this a little bit, I think it's only fair to say, are you crushing teams and are you struggling with teams? Because really, like you said, eye test is all we got.
Yeah, and like you said, I think the answer is at the end of the day, nothing's perfect, right? We have to come up with some way to rank the teams, some intelligent way to deal with the fact you've got teams at different conferences at different quality levels. And you have to deal with something pretty simple in college football, which is you don't really have that many really good teams. There was an argument on Twitter that we got into, and Daniel and I were chatting back and forth about like Texas A&M the last couple of years and their really hard schedule in 2019, and what does that mean? And people have given us a lot of flack because we said, look, we don't think Texas A&M is a phenomenal football team, but we think they're better than people give them credit for. They had an incredibly hard schedule, maybe historically hard. And when you're playing, at one point it was like number 1, number 2, number 3, number 5, and number 6 or something like that. But it was like 5. They played like 5 of the top 6 teams in the country. Yeah, most teams are going to go 7-5 in that schedule, or in 8-5. And the person that came back and said, well, but that's not good enough. And if it were me, I wouldn't have ranked them. And our question back to that person was, okay, well, that's fine. Who would you have ranked instead? Because, at the end of the day, we can complain about all these things, but you've got to rank somebody somewhere. And we talked about, well, what was what was Texas A&M's best win? I was like, okay, well, fine. What's Appalachian State's best win? Because they were ranked. What was Cincinnati's best win? Because they were ranked. And when Cincinnati played Ohio State, they got the doors blown off them. When they played Memphis twice, they lost both times. I mean, they lost all their good games too, but we ranked them because of pure win-loss. That's where we diverge a little bit. Is I don't think Texas A&M was a top 15 team. Look, I mean, they weren't really overly competitive in most of those games, but they were a reasonably good team. I think it's more ridiculous sometimes when you look at the list and you see who we did rank. Somebody like Appalachian State. I mean, Appalachian State's best win probably, was maybe either UCF or South Carolina. They barely beat South Carolina. It took a miracle to do so. South Carolina was not a very good team.
Texas A&M killed South Carolina.
Right, and Texas A&M killed South Carolina. So why is App State ranked ahead of them? It was purely win-loss. And that's where you lose us a little bit, and that's where I think you have to get into, well, who are they playing? What does their general level of play look like in the conference they're in? How good were they last year? Like SP Plus and most of these rankings, Football Power Index from ESPN, which I have a lot of problems with. That's a different discussion. But they all tend to factor in things like recruiting rankings. And it's all basically, to be honest, smoke and mirrors, trying to say, look, we know conferences aren't really created equal, and we know win-loss records don't mean the same thing in different conferences. There is very, very low parity in the sport of college football. Totally different than college basketball, totally different than any other sport in the country. It's why it's interesting to us, but it's also what makes it unique. And you have to bear all that in mind. So when we do preseason polls and we look at this different stuff, look, our model doesn't base anything off last year because we want an objective baseline. So it's totally blind to all that. But when we apply our eye test and we look how good you are on a field and we look at how you played relative to your own games, and we consider how good you were last year and how many star recruits you have, what conference you're in, it's because that stuff all matters. And that plays out year in and year out with non-conference games, with bowl games and whatnot. It's not a perfect system, but it's something you have to run with.
Lord help our model this year. Since it relies on interconnected data points, that's going to be a struggle. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about maybe, and you've touched on this or sort of hinted at this a little bit. I want to talk about the possibility of forgiveness of a loss here or there that we wouldn't have forgiven in years past. And I know Ohio State fans are frustrated in years past, and all fans do this, but Ohio State fans do this a lot because they've been up there a lot. They tend to compare cross years, which doesn't really work. You can't say, well, Alabama got in this year and we didn't get in the next year, because the scenarios are totally different. But there have been, in my opinion, some unforgivable losses from Ohio State in the past that really kept them out, Purdue, Iowa, in different seasons. This year, could you see a scenario where, and maybe it's not Ohio State, maybe it's Michigan, maybe Ohio State runs the table and it doesn't matter. Could you see a scenario where we are more forgiving of a loss because of the weirdness of this season, and we unfairly give a team the benefit of the doubt because of pedigree in years and who they've been in years past, where we wouldn't have in other seasons?
I think it's inevitable this year. There's always a debate in college football. Do you make the playoff the highest quality team or the team that's the most deserving based off win and loss? And it gets into the question of what is the best team. And I think the playoff committee's mantra is that they put the best teams in, but there's different ways to rank that. Our look at it has always been, how did you do with your schedule, and how would you have done with their schedule? And when a couple years ago, when Ohio State was losing games they shouldn't, our view was, if you dropped those games, you would have dropped games with somebody else's schedule, right? Even if you were in the Big 12, you would have dropped a couple random games because that was something you were going to do, or you were going to have down performances, et cetera, et cetera. Just trying to compare apples and oranges in that manner. But this year, even that, I think you're going to take a step back from that, because you're going to know teams have lost due to reasons other than how good or bad they were, but due to circumstance. I mean, Auburn has already missed several practices this season due to COVID concerns in the fall. So not only to not get a spring practice, not only were they kind of limited in the summer, but then they can't fully practice in the fall. Tennessee had to has missed scrimmage time in the fall. They've been unable to conduct scrimmages because they didn't have enough healthy players or non-positive no non-contact tracing players to be able to practice. Navy had a lot of concerns, not only with their own administration, but there's some issues with the state of Maryland and restrictions they have on contact that affect the way teams practice and scrimmage in the state of Maryland. There's a lot of stuff like that going on, and it's going to cause teams to lose games they shouldn't. If it doesn't matter who you are in college football, I know it's an 85-man roster, but the truth is most teams have 40 to 50 players that are actually ready to play. If you get the wrong subset of those that aren't available, you're going to lose a game that you shouldn't lose. And I think we're all going to take that into account. I think teams are going to kind of forgive it. And you have also weird situations like Arkansas State comes out and beats Kansas State. I can't tell you right now how much that was due to the fact that Arkansas State had played and Kansas State hadn't. I don't think that was totally it, but it took a lot of weird series of events for these games to conspire, and I'm not sure how much all that factors in. And how much do you want to read into a G5 loss this year when other teams don't have the opportunity to even lose to a G5 because they don't play them? When the ACC does play them, it'll be a few games in, so they're not going to have the disadvantage where Big 12 teams are playing G5 teams that had already played a game. Like we saw Miami played UAB. UAB had already played a game, and you could tell early on what team had played a game before and what team hadn't. So all this stuff matters. And I think what's going to wrap it in a bow, I think losses at the end of the season are going to be taken a lot more seriously than losses early in the season. About the first half of the season, we all know it's going to be a little crazy. And I think we're gonna hand wave a lot if somebody like an Alabama or an LSU or an Auburn loses a random game. We're gonna kind of go, well, it's kind of weird. It's week 1. They didn't practice much. I think the last third of the season, that hand waving is going to go away, except in some situation where a lot of players aren't available. But in my mind, I think loss forgiveness is going to mean that you're going to probably get one team from each conference almost no matter what. They're just going to assume we don't know anything between the conferences. We have to forgive a loss no matter what. We're just going to have to take one from each conference because we really have no idea how to compare them, with the exception of if the Big Ten comes in or doesn't come in, right? That's going to determine how they pick a second one. I think it's going to be way the heck harder if they've got to pick 2 from the same conference. I think that's going to make it really freaking difficult. Or if one conference can't produce anybody with more than a couple losses, then you get really screwy with how much you want to forgive or not forgive. And then obviously the Big Ten was supposed to vote today. They didn't vote today. We have no idea. We've been waiting, and we at some point we had to record. We still don't know if the Big Ten's going to play. So there's a whole lot of variables involved in this.
Yeah, and I think that what's really maybe in the Big Ten's advantage if they do play and they can get a season in time for the playoffs, which that's a whole other thing, is like if they start on October 17th, is there enough time to get a season in and have enough lead time of the playoffs? I think there is. But if they can do that, then, and they don't have these weird OOC losses that we might have to forgive and look past, they're in a lot better position than the Big 12, because the Big 12, even though we have to forgive a loss here or there, and I think it's completely fair, this opening weekend is disastrous. And it wasn't just one team stubbing their toe. It was so many teams stubbing their toe that it really puts a question mark on how good a season an Oklahoma or a Texas is really going to have. And it's really going to come down to who wins the game against one another. Because if they beat Kansas State or they beat Iowa State or Texas Tech, everybody's going to look back at, HBU or Louisiana or whatever and think, okay, big win, great. But if Michigan beats a Minnesota that maybe isn't as good as we think they're going to be, nobody will know. And all the teams, I think, will look a little bit cleaner because they're starting so late. Anyway, this was a fun discussion. We really didn't know what to talk about in terms of this because, like Josh said, it still is up in the air. Y'all, we are in SEC country, and we are pulling for the Big Ten to have a season like y'all have no idea. Like, we really want it. We were devastated, just like y'all were when they announced that there would be no season. So we're pulling for y'all. We're gonna hopefully drag y'all across the finish line. Thanks so much for hanging out with us for this one. Y'all have a great week, and God bless.